Something happened at the White House yesterday that nobody could have predicted. Donald Trump has held what was supposed to be a routine cabinet meeting. Within 15 minutes, even his most loyal supporters knew they had a serious problem on their hands. Fox News abruptly cut their live coverage of the event. They offered absolutely no explanation for why they stopped broadcasting. They simply switched to a commercial break and never returned to Trump's remarks. When the propaganda network that spent nearly a decade defending every Trump scandal decides he's too damaged to show their viewers, something fundamental has changed in American politics. This wasn't about editorial differences or disagreement over policy positions. This was pure damage control from a network desperately trying to protect its own credibility. They witnessed what millions of Americans are finally beginning to see for themselves: a man who is physically and mentally falling apart in real time before our eyes. Let me walk you through what actually transpired in that cabinet room before Fox News decided they couldn't air it anymore. The leaked footage shows Trump attempting to explain recent economic developments, but what emerged from his mouth was nothing short of complete incoherent rambling. He randomly threw out massive numbers that bore no connection whatsoever to economic reality or any factual data. We're bringing back 400 billion, maybe 500 billion, could be 600 billion from China. From everywhere, really. Numbers nobody has ever seen before, he mumbled, the digits clearly meaningless even to himself. At one jarring moment, Trump suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence and stared vacantly at the table surface for what felt like an eternity. His assembled staff members exchanged deeply concerned glances with each other, the precise kind of worried looks that experienced healthcare workers share when observing a patient's rapid cognitive decline. If you watch the footage carefully, you'll notice his hands desperately gripping the conference table edge with white-knuckled intensity. This wasn't a man casually sitting at a meeting conducting presidential business. He was physically bracing himself just to remain upright in his chair. Every single person in that room could plainly see what was happening, but nobody dared acknowledge the obvious truth out loud. But here's what should genuinely terrify every single American citizen watching this unfold. Trump's staff isn't attempting to help him recover or get proper medical attention. They're actively manipulating him like a puppet while pursuing their own separate political and financial agendas. Stephen Miller sits positioned directly to Trump's right, continuously feeding him pre-written talking points through a private back-channel communication system that bypasses official White House protocols entirely. J.D. Vance has begun conducting his own separate press appearances, deliberately positioning himself as the calm and competent alternative leader. Elon Musk now openly contradicts Trump's official policy statements on his social media platforms, fully aware there will be zero consequences for his public defiance. These people surrounding Trump aren't faithfully serving the elected president of the United States anymore. They're effectively running the entire country while he visibly deteriorates before everyone's eyes. And they're all getting obscenely wealthy while doing it without any accountability. Elon Musk's various companies have secured billions upon billions in lucrative government contracts since Trump returned to office. Stephen Miller has systematically expanded his bureaucratic influence to directly control multiple entire federal departments. J.D. Vance is already actively campaigning for the 2028 presidential race, cynically using White House resources as his personal political platform. The cabinet meeting concluded with Trump being hastily rushed out of the room by his security handlers. Absolutely no questions from the assembled press corps were permitted or answered. No reporters were allowed anywhere near him as he departed. His security detail formed a protective human barrier completely surrounding him as they quickly escorted him away from any cameras. Compare this carefully controlled exit to just 4 years ago when Trump would confidently stand before Marine One for an hour straight taking unlimited questions. Back during his first term, he possessed enough mental alertness to at least lie convincingly to reporters. Now he can barely complete a scripted sentence from a teleprompter without losing his train of thought. The cognitive decline has become so shockingly obvious that even his own propaganda network couldn't find any way to positively spin what viewers were witnessing. But here's where this situation becomes truly disturbing on a deeper psychological level. While Trump's mental faculties are rapidly failing, he has developed an all-consuming obsession with one thing above everything else: permanent monuments. Not governing the country, not developing coherent policy, not leading the nation, just desperately getting his name permanently carved into stone and bronze throughout America. Just last week, Trump attempted to openly blackmail Senator Chuck Schumer using federal infrastructure funding. The Gateway Project, absolutely critical transportation infrastructure serving the entire Northeast Corridor, is currently being held hostage by the White House. Trump has stated he will not release the desperately needed funding unless both Dulles International Airport and Penn Station get officially renamed after himself. Take a moment to truly absorb that statement. The sitting president is using infrastructure blackmail to force buildings to carry his name. This transcends typical political corruption or even standard authoritarian behavior. This represents the desperate actions of a profoundly insecure man in complete panic about how future generations will remember him. He forcibly renamed the iconic Kennedy Center, crudely adding his own name directly next to President John F. Kennedy's. He commissioned construction of an absolutely massive triumphal arch in Washington, D.C., essentially a monument dedicated entirely to himself that prominent architects and historians have directly compared to the worst megalomaniacal projects built by dictators like Joseph Stalin and Saddam Hussein. He's systematically attempting to rename military bases, federal office buildings, and literally any structure that receives government funding. Why has he suddenly developed this frantic obsession with physical monuments? Because Trump instinctively knows that his remaining time is rapidly running out. Historical analysis repeatedly shows us this identical psychological pattern across different eras. When authoritarian dictators sense approaching death, whether political or physical, they dramatically accelerate monument construction. Saddam Hussein's extravagant palace building went into absolute overdrive during his final isolated years under international sanctions. Joseph Stalin's cult of personality worship reached peak insanity as his extreme paranoia and failing health worsened. They frantically try cementing themselves into permanent stone, specifically because they have completely lost control of their own historical narrative. And Donald Trump has utterly lost control of his story already. You can clearly see this desperation reflected in his increasingly erratic social media posts. This week alone, Trump posted something that should deeply alarm every observer. He randomly started discussing whether he's going to be admitted into heaven after death. The corrupt, dishonest media falsely reports, "I said I won't get into heaven," he wrote completely unprompted by any news coverage. That was obviously a joke, but they deliberately report it seriously because they're terrible people trying to destroy me. Nobody in the media was actually reporting on Trump's potential afterlife prospects. He brought up this entire topic completely on his own initiative. Donald Trump, a man who never once mentioned God except when cynically pandering to evangelical voters, who famously couldn't name even a single Bible verse when directly asked, who proudly stated he's never once asked God for forgiveness, is now genuinely worried about divine judgment after death. That's not political strategy playing out, that's deep psychology manifesting. Multiple sources inside Mar-a-Lago have reported that Trump has been having detailed conversations about planning his own funeral arrangements. He obsesses over controlling every specific detail of how people will remember him after he's gone. He's literally attempting to negotiate with history itself in real time, and he's catastrophically losing that negotiation with each passing day. The Kennedy Center debacle serves as the absolutely perfect symbolic metaphor for Trump's legacy panic. After he forcibly inserted his name onto the building, after staging an elaborate, self-congratulatory renaming ceremony complete with cameras, Trump's newly renamed Kennedy Center suddenly closed its doors. The building just shut down indefinitely with no publicly announced reopening date. Officially, administrators claimed it's merely for routine renovations and internal reorganization work, but everyone understands what really happened behind closed doors. Donald Trump psychologically couldn't tolerate the inevitable idea that his name would sit directly next to the powerful legacy of an actual respected president, a president universally remembered for inspirational vision, masterful eloquence, and ultimate sacrifice for his country. Rather than allow that unfavorable comparison to exist for public viewing, rather than risk the building not receiving the worshipful treatment he demanded, he simply had the entire venue closed. Like a petulant child, he took his ball and went home. Here's my detailed prediction for the future, and I want you to document this for verification. Within just 10 years maximum, every single monument Trump is frantically building right now will become a source of national embarrassment. Hotels and buildings will systematically remove the Trump name to avoid customer boycotts, and numerous properties have already begun this process. Government buildings will quietly be assigned new names through legislation. The grandiose arch will either be demolished entirely or converted into something completely different. Even his own children will attempt distancing themselves from the toxic Trump brand, and some already are. The monuments he's so desperately constructing won't successfully protect or enhance his legacy whatsoever. They'll transform into places people visit primarily to laugh at his megalomania. Future tourists will go see Trump's folly, the exact same way people visit Confederate monuments today. Not to honor them or celebrate their existence, but to remember and learn from what we finally overcame as a society. Donald Trump senses this inevitable reality deep within himself. He absolutely knows this is his inescapable future, and that knowledge is psychologically destroying him from the inside. That's precisely why he's falling apart so visibly before our eyes. But this monument obsession isn't just about one aging narcissist's personal vanity crisis. This frantic legacy panic connects directly to something far more dangerous and systematically sinister. It connects to what his entire administration is actively trying to cover up and erase. At the precise moment Trump desperately builds monuments glorifying himself, his administration is systematically destroying other people's history, specifically and deliberately Black American history. The Erasure campaign started immediately from day one of this administration. The aggressive rollback of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs across all federal agencies. The physical removal of educational materials from Smithsonian Institution exhibits. The mandated changes to public school curriculum nationwide, specifically forcing schools to completely eliminate discussions of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and the civil rights movement from American history classes. Remember the absurd Enola Gay situation? They literally ran a computer search for the word gay across all federal museum records and started systematically deleting everything that appeared. They removed an entire historically significant exhibit about the B-29 bomber that dropped the atomic bomb purely because the word gay appeared in the plane's name. That represents the staggering level of ideological foolishness we're dealing with, but it's deliberate foolishness in service of one very specific goal: erasing inconvenient history. Many people correctly identify this as straightforward racism. Trump and his cabinet, full of white supremacists, simply don't want black history taught in schools. That analysis is absolutely true, but it's not the complete picture, because they're not erasing black history solely due to racial hatred. It's actually a calculated, strategic decision. Successful fascism fundamentally requires people to forget accurate history. Authoritarian rule simply cannot survive long-term if citizens remember how it actually works, what it looks like, who it targets, and most importantly, how it's been successfully resisted before. A recent podcast conversation between Andrew Schultz and Charlemagne the God perfectly captured this dynamic. Schultz, who, let's remember, spent years defending Trump and dismissing concerns as overreaction, was now expressing genuine shock. "I genuinely never thought I would see this happening in America," he said with visible distress. Armed federal agents shooting people in American streets, entire families being violently torn apart, people being hunted down without warrants. Now, Charlemagne's response was devastatingly simple, yet profoundly powerful in its truth. He calmly said, "You just never thought it would happen to white people." Because this is American history. This has always been American history for marginalized communities. Where do people think modern American policing originally came from? Slave patrols, that's the actual historical origin. Armed men given government authority to hunt down black people, return them to slavery, and systematically terrorize entire communities into absolute obedience. That's literally where American policing was born. The current ICE raids happening across America right now, with agents violently breaking into homes without proper warrants, tearing families apart, making people disappear into detention centers, that's a direct historical copy of the Fugitive Slave Acts. Federal agents given sweeping power to hunt human beings across state lines and forcibly drag them into bondage. The heavily militarized police beating peaceful protesters in American streets, the massive government surveillance tracking activist movements, the criminalization of mutual aid and helping each other. Black Americans have endured this exact oppression for over 400 years of American history. Indigenous Americans literally wrote the original blueprint in their own blood. What's happening right now isn't Trump somehow inventing American authoritarianism from scratch. It's American authoritarianism finally reaching everyone, including people who thought they were protected. And that's exactly why they must aggressively erase black history from education. If Americans truly understood that history, they would immediately recognize the patterns of what's happening right now. If we studied Frederick Douglass properly, we would know exactly how to speak powerful truth to corrupted power. If we learned about Harriet Tubman's work, we would understand how to build effective underground resistance networks. If we read Ida B. Wells extensively, we would know how to carefully document atrocities and force the entire nation to directly confront them. If we studied Fannie Lou Hamer's organizing, we would know how to build grassroots power locally and challenge fundamentally corrupt systems. If we learned about the Black Panther Party's community breakfast programs, we would know how to build mutual aid networks that make us less dependent on hostile government. If we studied A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin's work, we would know how to organize powerful labor movements that can completely shut down the economy. They're not erasing history because they hate the past. They're systematically erasing it because they're terrified of a well-informed future. They're absolutely terrified that if Americans understood how black communities resisted enslavement and ongoing oppression, we would know exactly how to resist them right now. Trump's monument building and history erasing are two sides of the identical authoritarian coin. Build monuments glorifying the regime, erase all monuments to resistance. Control the past, control the future. Except their strategy won't work. Because Trump's actual legacy is already written in permanent historical ink. The January 6th insurrection will be studied for centuries, not as patriotic uprising, but as a textbook fascist coup attempt by a president who violently refused to accept democratic defeat. His catastrophic COVID response, telling Americans to inject bleach while hundreds of thousands died, dismantling pandemic preparedness purely because Obama created it, that's his permanent legacy. Family separation policy, children locked in cages, toddlers forced to represent themselves in immigration court, thousands of families permanently destroyed. That's his legacy. 2 impeachments, 34 felony convictions, found liable for sexual assault, convicted of fraud, theft of classified documents. That's his legacy. Future students won't ask whether Trump was great. They'll ask how Americans were fooled twice. His name won't symbolize greatness. It will symbolize American democratic decline and the con artist who nearly destroyed the republic. Every monument he builds is one more structure to eventually demolish. Every name he adds is one more name to systematically remove. Every arch he constructs is one more symbol future generations will tear down. That's his actual legacy, and absolutely no amount of stone can change it. But you want to know what the real monument to this era will actually be? It absolutely won't be his arch or his renamed buildings. It will be the resistance movement, the millions who marched after his inauguration and never stopped marching for justice, the sanctuary cities that courageously refused to become deportation machines, the election workers who protected democracy while he sent violent mobs to threaten them, the journalists he called enemies who kept reporting truth anyway, the lawyers who filed thousands of lawsuits to block his worst impulses, the mutual aid networks that fed communities when his government failed them, the young climate activists who protested while he gutted environmental protections, the families separated by ICE who are fighting to reunite, the trans youth he tried to erase who refused to disappear. That's the monument. That's what history will teach. Not his buildings, not his speeches, but the fact that millions of Americans confronted authoritarianism and said, no, the monument to this era is every person who resisted, and we're building that monument right now. Which brings me directly to Chuck Schumer and that airport naming blackmail. Senator Schumer, you have one critical job. Do not negotiate with terrorists. Do not build monuments to dictators. Do not give this collapsing autocrat one more piece of legacy preservation while he actively destroys American democracy. The answer to Trump's blackmail must be simple and absolute. No. Build the Gateway Project because it's essential infrastructure. Name it after the workers who built it, not the wannabe dictator who held it hostage. This is a test for every Democrat who claims opposition. Will you actually resist, or will you make deals with fascism because it's easier?